learning a lot more, learning a lot more as consumers, and making decisions. And as I said, communicating those decisions, not just in terms of what you buy, but telling the companies that you decide to buy from or not to buy from, why you're doing it. Part of my background is I was in the technology journalism business back in the 1980s and 1990s. And we moved as a society, and you probably all remember this, from an analog existence to a digital one. And at the beginning, we were all digitally naive. Nobody knew what a computer, how it worked. You would have to ask a question like, what's a bit? What's a byte? What's the difference? How does a modem work? And that was all this basic information that, like sustainability today, wasn't even common knowledge or even available to all of us. It hadn't been defined. And during the 80s and 90s, I helped to define some of these things. And so I have learned that we can move people quickly from one way of life to another with information. But the fact is that sustainability has to happen twice as fast as digitization did. So we have to move from sustainability naive to sustainability native, where we just know these things and take them for granted, in a decade in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So remember Earth Overshoot Day every year and watch for it to start to creep back up. We first started exhausting all the resources on the planet in 1970 and started working backwards into the years since then. We can reverse that trend now. So let's talk about fast fashion. What is it? Fast fashion refers to the practice of quickly producing and selling inexpensive clothing that follows the latest fashion trends. And this is partly not just a function of our ability to ship stuff all over the world, but of 24/7 always-on media, which just bombards people, particularly children, with messages telling them that they should grasp for novelty. And so things like appreciating a well-made item of clothing or the people who take care of their clothing have been lost. And that's something that we can bring back by thinking about this and talking about it. Who's responsible for fast fashion? There's really 4 companies that sell most of this stuff. There's Zara, H&M, Forever 21, and Shein, which is a Chinese company. It's spelled S-H-E-I-N. What this has led to is poor quality items with a short lifespan being sold all over the world for, as I said a few minutes ago, $4, $5, $6 per item. So you can buy a top and kids get the idea that it's okay to go ahead and toss this stuff after 1 or 2 uses. It's cheap, but it carries a heavy environmental cost. According to a study by the Environmental Protection Agency, the average amount of CO2 emitted by a pound of textiles when you put it in a landfill is 1.3 pounds of CO2. And that's just from it spoiling in the ground, which takes decades. So this is something we can reverse and avoid by not sending stuff to the landfill. Now, this whole notion of designed and delivered just in time relies on a shipping system that is anchored in Asia. And a lot of it is airship, which is the most polluting way to move things around the world. The really unfortunate thing here is that the youth of our country, who are generally very tuned into the environmental consequences of what they do, account for most of these purchases. 80% of fast fashion buyers are between the age of 15 and 35, and 86% of them are women. So what we see now is everyone being told on almost a monthly basis that all our lines of clothing are no longer cool. And that's what people are reacting to. 82% of shoppers buy more than 10 garments a year, according to a recent survey. And what the International Journal of Consumer Studies found is that these things are actually designed to be used or worn only 10 times. And in fact, they're only worn an average of 7 times by the purchaser. So this is really a genuinely wasteful way of going about life. The other issue that you have to keep in mind in judging the environmental impact of the clothing that you buy is the materials it's made from. And you may look at these percentages and think they add up to more than 100%, and you will be correct. And that's because many of these textiles are blended in various ways. So this represents the items of clothing that are using these different types of material. Plastic accounts for most of the clothing we wear today, and in particular polyester. That's 45.6% of the clothing that is sold in fast fashion. Now, generally, polyester is also the most recyclable material that we have in clothing. It's the same stuff that a PET bottle, the water bottle that you buy at the store, or a Coke bottle, is made of. But because of the way the recycling industry works, you can't recycle them all together with current technology. We'll talk a little later, particularly in the questions section, about how plastic recycling is evolving. Now, a lot of people would say, well, great, I'm going to go ahead and buy cotton clothing, and that'll be better. But cotton is a very water and fertilizer intensive plant, and it accounts for about 220 million tons of CO2 emissions a year, just from the farming process. A single cotton t-shirt requires 710 gallons of water to make. And that really, if you think about the billions of items of clothing, is an immense number. And many of the factories that use this water don't recirculate it. They just use it and dump it back into the environment, often polluted. Now, there are other things that you can look for, like you won't see viscose called out very often, but you'll see that something's made from bamboo, eucalyptus, or sugarcane fiber, or corn husks. And that's another more sustainable option, but it does generally account for a lot of environmental damage, because 150 million trees a year are taken down in order to make viscose, and it requires toxic ingredients to actually turn the tree or plant material into a more manageable fiber. Without a doubt, the best choice, if you're going to buy some fashion item, particularly a fast fashion item, is linen. It's a plant-based material. It's very water efficient. Only 1.7 gallons of water per t-shirt, for instance, is required. And it does still have some environmental consequences. The fertilizer that is used to treat flax plants is often responsible for creating algal blooms in waterways, both rivers and bays. So if you see an out point into a bay, maybe nearby your home, and an algae bloom going on there, it's because of materials that are similar to what linen is treated with. But if you're going to make this choice, linen's the best one. Now, I'm going to go through a whole bunch of environmental impacts, but you can see here that there's an obvious problem with the landfill waste. This chart shows the rapid ascent of landfill waste from textiles over the past 50 years. Essentially, we throw away 3/4 of everything we make, and we throw it away within a year of purchasing it for the most part. There's this overproduction of all this fast fashion item is what started around 2010. And you can see we took a huge leap up in terms of total volume at that time. The other thing is, as most of the world has moved into a more modern and higher income lifestyle, people are buying a lot more clothes. So there are a number of different things that are contributing to this. But this is the waste just in the United States. And we're talking here about literally billions of tons of material. The other thing you have to think about is water pollution. Textile dyeing, like I was saying earlier, the treatment of the material to make it more malleable, releases toxic chemicals. It releases into the waterways. It also is embedded in the clothing that you buy in many cases. You are actually exposing yourself to PFAS and other materials, chemical materials, when you put these clothes on. So we want to be aware of the fact that when we buy some of this, we're not just putting on something that's potentially toxic, but something that is probably polluted several waterways and contributed to several pounds of CO2 emissions just from shipping it over to the United States. The next thing I want to talk about is greenhouse gas emissions. And we're going to get a little technical because it's actually worth going through. There's an idea of embodied carbon. Embodied carbon is the footprint of making the material itself, so treating the flax that we were talking about, or taking down the trees, producing it, transporting it, and disposing of it. So when you buy something, it already has a carbon footprint from all of the production. And that's true not only of clothing, but of a telephone. If you buy a new iPhone, that comes with an embodied carbon footprint of about 135 pounds of CO2. Now, there are several different types of CO2 emissions, and you're going to hear more about them over the next few years as we become, as I said, more digitally native. There are Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. And developing an understanding of that full life cycle impact of our lifestyle is very useful. Scope 1 emissions are the emissions directly created by a company or for each of us when we live our lives. It's the stuff we have direct control over. Scope 2 emissions represents the emissions associated with the energy that powered whatever you're doing. So my Scope 1 emissions are what I emit out of my house or directly by driving my car. But Scope 2 emissions are the emissions I'm responsible for because of the electricity I use. When they generate that electricity, there's a carbon footprint associated with it. Right now, most companies are only able to assess their Scope 1 and 2 emissions because this is complicated stuff. Scope 3 emissions is everything else. And if you start to pay attention to the environmental reporting and commitments that companies are making, you'll see that most of the time, their Scope 3 emissions account for 90% of their carbon footprint. That means it's out of their control almost entirely. I had the chief sustainability officer at eBay on my podcast last week. It went live earlier this week. And 99% of eBay's emissions are Scope 3 emissions. So basically, they have to ask somebody to make a change. They can't make a direct change. And that's the challenge all of us face. How do we get rid of what we emit by reducing our emissions? And how do we ask the people who sell us the stuff that come with all that embodied carbon footprint to reduce their emissions? So again, our ability to communicate as consumers back to the companies and say, I'd really like a change and I'd appreciate it and would continue to buy from you, can have a powerful effect. So thinking about fast fashion, there are 6 ideas for making clothing, especially fast fashion, last longer. And that includes investing in higher quality clothing, repairing damaged items, washing clothes less often, and using eco-friendly detergents, as well as air drying clothes and donating or reselling clothes so that they continue to be used, so that embodied carbon footprint is spread out over more time. You might have heard the idea of carbon offsets, where you buy some carbon emissions and have them put into the ground or into a tree. This helps you just avoid using or creating more CO2. So extending the life of something that's been manufactured is absolutely the most environmentally responsible thing you can do any day. But the other thing to keep in mind is that carbon is just one facet of our impact. Deforestation, soil loss, the depletion of soils due to tilling and the use of fertilizers, and a series of sources of toxins at every step along the way from the farm or the oil derrick to your store and your home are involved in how our lifestyles impact the planet and the environment. So resource depletion is the other thing you have to think about when you talk about fast fashion. They rely on the exploitation of natural resources, all the water that I was talking about earlier, the growing of all those different materials, particularly in Asian and lower income countries with poor regulations, often leads to the destruction of the living systems in the soil, and it becomes unproductive. You might have read that there are concerns that our soil here in the United States will no longer be productive as of about 2045. But we're already working on how to resolve that problem with something called regenerative farming. Happy to talk about that during questions and answers. Now, another thing that we want to talk about is microplastic pollution. And these are microplastic chips that you see in somebody's finger here. This stuff is created by almost everything we do, because almost everything we use these days is made of plastic. Synthetic fabrics, will shed this stuff when you wash them, polyester and nylon, for instance. And when you use a bottle of water or you refill a plastic bottle, some of that breaks off into small amounts of plastic that you consume. So after plastic packaging, which accounts for 42% of all the plastic used, textiles are the second largest source of plastic waste in the world. And in 2015, textiles accounted for 42 million tons of plastic. 80%, well, almost 81% of that plastic, of the plastic that reached the oceans in 2021 came from Asia. And now we hear a lot about plastic pollution in the seas, which is critically important to understand. It comes from 2 sources: garbage flowing out of rivers into the oceans, and about 60% of it is fishing gear that is tossed overboard or cut loose by fishermen rather than collected and taken home so that it's not polluting the environment. But when we wash our clothes, one of the most damaging things we do every day, especially if you're using hot water, you're releasing microplastics into the water that is being released and sent to the wastewater treatment facility, where much of it never is actually captured, and it continues and gets out into nature. The really ugly fact is that collectively, we each eat about a credit card's worth of microplastics a week in the various forms of food that we consume. So we need to cut down microplastic pollution. I mentioned deforestation earlier, and it's something that we should all be aware of, not just because of our fashion, but for instance, the use of toilet paper accounts for literally tens of thousands and thousands of acres of virgin forest, particularly in British Columbia these days, being taken down annually just in order to make toilet paper. So another way that we can change is reducing our fast fashion consumption and thinking more broadly about the other ways that we can reduce our impact. Now, let's talk a little more about some of the human issues here. Chemical exposure factories, which have made a lot of progress in recent years, is a really serious concern. Workers in fast fashion factories are exposed to thousands of chemicals to make that clothing and the textiles. There was an article in Harper's Bazaar, the magazine, in 2019 that analyzed the textiles that they purchased from H&M and IKEA. And when they did that analysis, they found that 8.7% of the clothing that they bought contained chromium, which is a carcinogen, and 27% contained, I'll try to say this correctly, alkyl phenyl ethioxylates, or APEOs. And this is an endocrine disruptor, and so can mess with our body's normal functions and in various ways lead to cancer. And fast fashion isn't the only culprit. Harper's did a study in 2016 and found that, Greenpeace reported on a Greenpeace study in 2016 that found that outdoor gear that it had bought in Europe and around the United States, 34 out of the 40 products tested contained PFAS, polyfluoral chemicals that are, you may have heard them, they're called forever chemicals. They don't break down in nature, they just stay there. So if you're buying a lot of clothes, including clothes from Patagonia, the greenest of the green, you're sometimes being exposed to PFAS and other classes of chemicals that are used to provide water and stain repellency. And these have been delayed to things like developmental delays and cancer and infertility. So when you are looking for brands, look for well-established, look for companies with well-established safety and toxic chemical policies. You should be able to find this on their websites, and you may be able to increasingly find them in their e-commerce listings. So there might even be, and I think Patagonia is an excellent example of this, a complete, they'll call them more and more product passports. It explains where the product was made, who made it, how they were treated in terms of the labor treatment, the chemicals that were used, where the material was sourced, how it was shipped. And so you're starting to see the articulation of the entire environmental impact and social impact of the manufacture of different kinds of products, but particularly clothing. In a lot of ways, the fashion industry, as bad as it can be, is leading the way on this. So there are standards that you can look for. There's Oikotex, which is OEKO-TEX. It's called the Oikotex Standard 100. That's probably the most comprehensive safety and well-made product certification in the world. Another one that you'll see frequently is described as GOTS, G-O-T-S, which is the Global Organic Textile Standard. There's also Cradle to Cradle and something called Blue Sign. All four of those certifications are good indicators that the company is using responsible practices. But that doesn't make them completely clean. It just means they're doing better than most. Now, the other thing about the use of all that water I was talking about before is that it ends up in, it does two things. It carries pollutants into the environment, but it also warms natural waterways. And that can harm the growth of fish and other life in the water, as well as damage the whatever's growing along the edges of the stream. So you want to see brands that are committing to reduce their water use too. This is not something that is widely discussed at this point, but you'll see more and more disclosures about the fact that a brand has reduced its water usage by 40% or 50% or 90%. There are actually technologies now that can allow a factory to use a completely closed loop or circular system, as I was talking about earlier, where they're reusing all of the water constantly. They take it out, they treat it, they cool it so that it's useful to cool equipment again and run it back through the factory. And by doing so, over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, industry can stop producing, or rather extracting so much water for free from the environment and dumping it back in. It will simply be managed as a continuously reused resource. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, besides, well, the last two things I want to talk about are biodiversity loss. Pesticides and chemicals are that are used in fast fashion, but in a variety of other contexts as well, harm biodiversity. You've heard about the decline of bees and monarch butterflies. If we lose our pollinators, we lose how we pollinate all the food crops that we grow. So we need to stop using pesticides. And you also, because of the destruction of forests that I was talking about before, seeing the critical loss of various species all over the world. We're entering what's been described as the sixth great extinction. And the rate of extinctions, even though it's still in the hundreds or thousands of species a year of the billions that exist on the planet, is accelerating at an alarming rate. So thinking about the role of the company that you're purchasing your clothing from in their relationship with the forests and the biological environment in which we all have to live is critically important. And the last thing is a very important and social one, and that is the fast fashion industry often relies on exploitative labor practices. It isn't fair for us to live well on somebody else's low wages, long hours, and unsafe working conditions. It's a problem we addressed in the United States 150 years ago and still continue to make progress on. But we need to see this across all industries all over the world. So you can look for clothing that doesn't harm people. And there are several certifications that you can look for to do that. Fair trade certified covers safe working conditions. So you can be assured, if it's fair trade certified, that no slave labor or child labor was involved, that people were paid equitably, and that they weren't exposed to a lot of chemicals. A second certification is SA 8000, which is often presented in conjunction with the letters SAI for Social Accountability International. And this covers human and social rights for workers and ensures that they're treated fairly. Another certification is RAP for the Worldwide Responsible Accredited Production Program, and that looks at labor treatment, primarily in the clothing industry. The RAP certification is one that you should be looking for in any fashion brand these days. The Ethical Trading Initiative covers workers' rights and their ability to organize. And the Social Accountability Accreditation Service, or SAAS, covers fair workplace and social responsibility, the fair treatment of people in the workplace, and the social responsibility of the organization. And finally, look for the Fair Wear Foundation, wear like you would wear clothing, which covers labor treatment standards in clothing manufacturing specifically. So again, you're going to see more and more of these certifications. Some of them will be manufactured private certifications that are actually forms of greenwashing or social washing. So do some homework and, hopefully go back and read the notes from this presentation later too. So we've talked about all the bad things that happen to the planet and people, but let's talk about the fact that these are just really not a good deal. Fashion may look good, but on average, a fast fashion item is only worn a few times before it's discarded. And studies indicate that an item of clothing in Britain is worn an average of only 7 times before it's thrown away. And in 2019, Patagonia studied the average number of times their clothes were worn. It's 82. So part of what Patagonia has done is created a culture of making stuff last. And that's an example of a brand doing the right thing and leading the way in the right direction. But as you can see from all the other data here, people are just getting used to wearing and throwing things away in a very short time. Ellen MacArthur Foundation found that the average number of times a garment is worn has decreased by 36% over the last 15 years. And about 60% of all clothing produced ends up in an incinerator or a landfill within a year of manufacturing. Another UK charity, Bernardo's, found that younger consumers are more likely to dispose of clothing after one wear. And 33% of 18 to 24-year-olds admit to wearing clothes only once before discarding them. Now, this is also the generation that is going to feel the most deepest impact of climate change if we do not avoid the 1.5 degree threshold. So there's a lot of irony here, but we can help our young friends, and I say that now as an old dude, make better choices about clothes, encourage them to make those clothes last longer. And most importantly, if they don't want them anymore, find a way to help other people reuse them to continue the full life of that product, because that embodied carbon footprint we talked about before is still a reality for every product we purchase. So if we can wear something 50 times instead of 5 times, the overall carbon impact, because you've avoided making new clothes, is 10 times less. So there are real opportunities for each of us to make a difference. Now, what can we do to lower our environmental impact from our clothes? You can avoid buying fast fashion. You can wash less. This will help the clothing last longer. I admit this, and my wife hates it when I do, but I don't wash my clothes every time I wear them. I hang them up and let them air out, and I'll wear them again. So it's an investment on my part in lowering my use of hot water and cold water, detergents, as well as making my clothes last. So there's a number of benefits from that strategy, which again, not everybody's going to like, including my wife. When you're wash in cold water. That'll do a couple of things. It will reduce wear on the clothing, and it will reduce the release of microplastics from plastic-based textiles. And if you wash delicates, put them in a laundry bag, because it will prevent that the shedding of the microplastics as well, and protect the material for longer. But I think that it's not that the skill has been lost, but the appreciation of mending and repairing has declined so much over the past 50 years. Learning to love clothes and to treasure them and to tell people why you take care of them is part of the process of getting everybody to start thinking again about how do we reduce the impact of our lifestyles by making different choices about what we buy, how we take care of it, and what we do with it when we're done. Air drying is another thing that will help, using eco-friendly detergents. And by the way, when you see the phrase eco-friendly, it is a greenwashing term because it's incredibly vague. You're about to see here in the United States, following some new laws that have been put in place in Britain and now in the EU just this week, anytime a brand uses a phrase like eco-friendly or environmentally responsible or any green friendly product, they're going to have to provide quantitative information that backs that claim up. They're going to have to be able to show that this product is literally 50 or 60 or 70% less impactful, instead of just using these funny made up words. So becoming aware of the greenwashing words that you're being exposed to more and more often is a great way to tune your mind to identify when you're being told that something that is bad for everybody is good for you. Last but not least, if you haven't been able you don't want to keep something you've kept in good shape, donate or resell the clothes. And generally do that at a thrift shop rather than at a Goodwill or a Value Village, because most of the stuff, and we'll get into this in a few minutes, that gets donated into those large chain stores, donation stores, ends up being not recycled in landfills and exported overseas. So, excuse me for a moment. What can you do? You can join the circular economy. In other words, start to be one of the people who reuses everything, or if they can't reuse it, helps other people use it. There are real alternatives to fast fashion that provide sustainable clothing options. And clothing resale sites, and I've got a list here for you, like ThredUp, Poshmark, Depop, The Real, they all offer pre-owned clothing. They've taken the time to curate the collection, so they're not going to send you something that's full of holes. And they provide a circular economy for the fashion industry. Sustainable clothing brands are another good choice. And companies like Patagonia, Everlane, and Reformation focus on not only ethical, sustainable production practices, but they also have repair programs. Patagonia now will allow you to send back an item, and they'll clean it up for you and send it back. My favorite brand of boots, I can now send my boots back whenever they wear out. They'll resole them, they'll restitch them. And so I can get the same, I can get 5 times the life out of the same pair of boots that I used to. It cost me, $80 to $120 each time I have them resoled and repaired, but they last a lot longer. So think about going to a thrift shop or checking out one of these online stores. If you're thinking about needing a change and you want to get rid of a product, see about sending it to one of these or donate it to a thrift store. Now, there's another option that's emerged over the last few years, the rental marketplace. And it's interesting, but it also carries substantial CO2 emissions from packaging, shipping, and returning the clothing after each use. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation found that an average carbon footprint of a garment over its entire life, including production, transportation, use, and disposal, is approximately 22 kilograms of CO2. So quickly doing the math, that's about 48 pounds of CO2 for every item of clothing. Shipping and returning a garment, such as through Rent the Runway or any of the other sites that you see here, say 10 times, will more than double its carbon impact just based on moving it back and forth in the boxes you put it in and took it out of and then put it in another box. So again, embodied carbon footprints are everywhere. When we reuse or rent products like this, the shipping back and forth is a heavy environmental consequence. Likewise, if you are a person who likes to order, say, 3 or 4 different items from Amazon in slightly different sizes to make sure you get the right one and send the 3 that didn't fit back, that carries an immense amount of CO2 emissions into the economy. And you should really try to think about making decisions that don't require you to do so much return shipping. So the renting option is interesting, but be aware of the fact that if you rely on it constantly, that you are contributing to a lot of CO2. Okay, so now we're going to talk about recycling, which is what Earth911 focuses on. We make a lot of waste, and you can see here, we generate about 25 billion pounds of textiles in the United States annually, or 82 pounds per person. And 21 billion pounds of that, almost all of it ends up in landfills, despite all the recycling that we claim we do. The average here reflects all the textiles and uses, but our consumption drives these numbers. The average American tosses out 70 pounds of clothing every year. So 12 pounds they keep, 70 pounds they throw away. But there are organizations out there that encourage you to donate this clothing or recycle it and have it sent overseas, which is an environmental disaster. One of these organizations is the Secondary Materials and Recycled Textiles Association, or SMART, although they don't for some reason use the A at the end. Maybe they would see what that might start leading into. But they report that 60% of, and this is a quote, more than 60% of recovered textile waste is sent abroad to more than 100 countries, equating to 1.4 billion pounds of used clothing, creating hundreds of thousands of jobs worldwide. That sounds great, doesn't it? Sounds like we're sending stuff overseas, clothing people and giving them jobs. Those jobs are in landfills. Those jobs are the worst paying, poorly treated jobs on the planet. Now, you'll notice they said 1.4 billion pounds of clothing is exported out of the 80 billion pounds that we throw away, or the 21 billion pounds that we throw away. So this is a small fraction, but what happens is it gets warehoused and packaged up and sold, say, to an African country, where somebody is then given the job of sorting out the good stuff and throwing away the rest. So that's how it ends up in the landfill. Now let's talk about goodwill. Green America did some research on goodwill a few years ago, and they found that roughly 5% of the donated clothing that they received are sent directly to landfills because it's just not in good shape. The rest of that sits in the stores for about 4 weeks, and then they move it to something called a goodwill outlet. And these are in 35 different states. They bundle all this stuff up and they sell it for 99 cents a pound. And what they don't sell, they then send to Goodwill auctions where vast bins full of stuff are sold for about $35. That's the stuff that ends up getting exported. The other thing that happens to that, and I was really surprised by this, and it's represented by the image that you're looking at, is it gets baled up and stored in warehouses, mostly along the northern border of the United States, because the only three substantial textiles recycling plants in the country are on the Canadian border, on one side or the other, usually in Canada. And it just sits there. They don't have enough capacity, recycling capacity, to deal with this stuff. And so they end up storing more and more and more. There are literally hundreds of thousands of square feet of warehouse space filling up with our old clothing bundled up like this. And a lot of that does ultimately end up getting shipped overseas, or it doesn't get recycled into anything useful. It gets recycled into basically fluff that can be used for certain types of insulation. So we are told that we are recycling, but we are not actually following through on it when we send it through these donation companies. The real recycling problem here in the United States is that the entire system is still predicated on the way that we organized life in the 1950s. It's called the single stream approach. And you know this, it's the garbage truck shows up and takes your stuff away, and then they sort it out and supposedly recycle it. And that's true to a degree. But the way that we currently do recycling is very inefficient, given how much more stuff we make today. So we need to make a substantial investment in the recycling system in the United States so that more of this stuff can be recycled, not only at all, but closer to us, so that there's less shipping of the material back and forth between the different locations. It's not actually environmentally sustainable to take a product, a used product, like that pair of pants we're looking at, ship it to Asia where it gets recycled in some way into another item and then shipped back to us. That does not make sense. Now, in 2018, you may remember that China stopped taking our recycled materials. It was a decision they called the National Sword Policy. And what they didn't really stop taking our materials. They said, we're not going to take your dirty materials anymore. The average contamination rate, in other words, all the stuff that was mixed in with our recyclables that made it unrecyclable when we sent that stuff overseas, was about 24%. So most of the time they would receive the material and only 75% of it would be recyclable, but because it was all mixed together, it was impractical to do. And so it ended up being thrown away too. When National Sword was put in place, they said, we'll take anything that isn't contaminated more than 0.25%, so 1/1000th of the old level. They didn't do it just to be jerks to us. They stopped taking our junk, and we are now investing. And this is where there's some real hope. You're going to see a new generation of recycling capability coming into production, and it's already starting to happen over the next year to 5 years. Glass recycling will start to take off again. Most of it stopped after the National Sword Policy. Plastic recycling is on the verge of moving from the mechanical approach that we use today to what's called enzymatic or chemical recycling, that doesn't just melt it down, but breaks it down into the monomers that the polymers are made from. So it turns it into just basically different pools of chemicals and materials that can be recombined to make new versions of the plastic. This is hopefully, if it works, and I'm not endorsing this because I haven't seen it completely proven yet, but if this works, there is a real possibility that all that polyester, the 34% we were talking about, the material being included in all that 34% of our clothing, could actually be recycled. Not only that, but it could be recycled with other forms of plastic that have never been able to be combined in the traditional system. I'm sure you all know the 7 resin identification numbers. Number 1 is the PET bottles that you all buy. PET, the number 1 plastic, is also what the berry containers, they're called thermoforms, are made of. But you can't mix a PET bottle and a thermoform PET container in today's recycling system because they melt at different temperatures. And so they cannot be combined. If you have one plastic bottle or one thermoform with another in the wrong load, the whole load is lost. With enzymatic or chemical recycling, it doesn't matter. Even clothing, polyester clothing could be mixed with the PET bottles because it's all all number one resin. So there's some really profound changes coming, and I would encourage you to be hopeful rather than skeptical about a recycling system. We can make improvements. So I don't want you to feel like this is all bad. A lot of us care about this stuff. We're not alone. 89% of consumers told a survey company, Wunderman Thompson, that they believe that brands should do a lot more to reduce their carbon impact. And 88% say that they believe that sustainability should be a standard practice. 88% of 88% of those consumers also say that those companies have a responsibility to take care of the planet. These people are on your side, and we're all starting to speak out and make changes. So I encourage you to talk with your neighbors, do a little informing, and then let's get this conversation going at an even higher rate than it is today. I talk to even clothing company CEOs every week, and they do want to do this right. They just don't feel the urgency because they're making so much money today. And I would encourage you all to just be resolute about looking for the right brand, looking for the right certifications, taking more time before you purchase an item of clothing. In other words, even if it's fast fashion, slow the decision down, and that's how you start to make a change. Now, just to throw in a plug, if you need to recycle something, Earth911 can help you. In this case, you can visit search.earth911.com, type in textiles, and put your zip code in. And you can see here, we searched your zip code. There are several options for recycling clothing near you. If you're interested, we have about 2,500 volunteers who contribute to curating our database. These are people who care about their community's ability to recycle. They might be municipal recycling workers. Sometimes they're nonprofit members, but we set them up with an account so that they can track what's going on locally, add it to our database, and help their neighbors find it. So if you're interested in doing that, please reach out to us. We would appreciate the help. And I think you'll find it very rewarding. You can send us email at admin@earth911.com. So finally, if we learn, if we think, if we act, and if we communicate, we can make a difference. This country's built on that idea that democracy and the people are in control. So we should learn about our choices, focus on brands that take responsibility, and share information about their products. Buy pre-owned. Take care of the things that you buy, especially the clothing. Choose what you need, not just what you want, and shop your values. Think about things. Don't just take what you're given, and share what you learn. We can research and support sustainable and ethical clothing brands. We can buy pre-owned clothing from clothing resale sites. We can make our clothing last longer by adopting these habits, and we can reduce our clothing consumption by purchasing only what we need. And all we have to do is tell our friends about that impact, and they will begin to understand this, and all of us will get out of this together. And that is what I have to say today, and I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you very much. I realize I've been looking over here slightly to the right because that's where I can see the other people's faces. So I don't put you right in front here.
Hi, Mitch, it was excellent.
Thank you.
But I think you were spot on. This is my only one comment. Because I was listening to something, I don't know if NPR or something, that in a third world country, if someone has to provide for a family, they're going to take that job making this $5 shirt.
Yeah.
Because if you have to choose between you're going to feed your children tonight or you're worried about being green. And I respect that. So it really comes down to demand, which you pretty much focused on. You're not going to change someone not going to that type of job because they, we have to change the demand.
I completely agree. And I feel for and appreciate the predicament that worker is in. They should be treated well. They should have better choices. But choice is not evenly distributed in the planet, and we have to do things here in order to change their choices there.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Sure.
Oops, okay, so I feel like the past 10, 15 years, we've been brainwashed with like recycled. And I quickly found out that recycling is only good if there's a vendor that buys the items, the plastic, cup or whatever, and it varies from one state to the other. And I feel like it became quickly like a way to heal our soul or feel better because we're recycling. But I always I've been a big reuse person. And I found two things. I found like the brand that I used to buy because they were better quality are now making like shitty product, the quality is not the same.
Yep.
And the second thing is that, well, I hear people say, well, if you keep reusing, then you're hurting the economy by not buying the products. I mean,
Yeah, what do you mean? So unfortunately, I know way too much about this stuff, and I don't want to sound like I'm lecturing. The way there have been a lot of over-promising and under-delivering in recycling, and I think that's what accounts for that kind of. They're just telling us to do this so we feel better about ourselves. It's a little like the way that we talk about carbon offsets. So today, airlines are now saying, well, you're emitting carbon, but you can buy offsets, and sometime down the line we'll put it back in the ground. That's supposed to make you feel good about flying and just emitting as you normally do. But you should be thinking about the impact of the trip and if it's really important, just like buying an item of clothing. As I said, there's a lot of changes going on in the recycling industry, and you called out the question of whether or not there's demand for the material. So there's a lot of materials there's not much demand for. Absolutely, that's the case. Glass being one. For some reason, and it has mostly to do with the energy required to melt an existing bottle to make new glass, which takes about 80% more energy than making new glass. So therefore, new glass is less expensive than recycled glass, and just nobody recycles it. And that really stopped after the Chinese decision. But as I was talking about the plastic, I do think that plastic is on the verge of a major change. Now, that doesn't mean we should be using more plastic. We should still be judicious about when we choose to use a single-use item all the time. But if we buy some plastic and use it enough to make it worthwhile, and that's everybody's personal decision, we can reduce the overall impact of our built and manufactured environment, according to some studies, by about 30%. So if we became completely circular, 30% of our environmental impact would go away right away. Then, if we decarbonize the remaining manufacturing, in other words, we take the CO2 emissions out of the way we make things, we can reduce our overall carbon footprint by about as much as 70%. And we can do that in the next 20 years. Then the question is whether we get to true net zero, where overall society doesn't emit anything. And what happens when that happens? Well, all we stop doing then is stop warming the planet. There's still all that excess CO2 from the last 150 years out there to continue to warm the planet. And that's where something called carbon capture technology comes in. So, and again, I know I'm going on long here, but I apologize. We can, using that technology, which is not proven yet, but there are working examples now. And there's a company called Climeworks, which has an amazing facility in Iceland that pulls CO2 out of the air and injects it into the ground hundreds of feet down so that it is literally going to stay there forever. So that remaining CO2 that we're emitting, it pulled out of the environment, and we can start to cool the planet back down. And in order to do that, we need to take, roughly 50 trillion tons of CO2. And it's hard to imagine 50 trillion tons of anything being in the air around us, but it's there. And that's why the environment is 1.1 degrees warmer than it was just 100 years ago.
Yeah, I don't want to take too much more time, but like just quick recap: is glass a good thing? Because I changed all my container into glass. All my bottles are glass.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely, yes. Using glass, it's a completely inert and biological. It doesn't do anything to the biology when it does end up in a landfill. It would just be better if we recycled it.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I
I did have one question.
Mhm.
And I was wondering, is like when you talk about a carbon footprint, if you're reusing, does it drop the carbon footprint from the initial making of a
Yeah.
product?
Well, it doesn't cut the carbon footprint, but it prevents you from buying something new with more carbon footprint. So
Well,
let's,
because there are some parts to that, it adds to it, but in order to do that, but it's a lot better than buying
Yeah.
something completely new. Is what you're
absolutely,
saying.
yes, yeah. So you have a footprint, but it's like in accounting, you amortize that footprint over the life of the,
Oh, perfect. Now I understand when you talked about amortizing. That makes perfect sense to me.
right? So, and so uh, a cell phone has a carbon footprint that it really, you would have to use it for roughly 11 years to break even.
Ooh. Okay.
But that's also true at a different scale of an item of clothing you pay $4.99 for and use only once. So and the question is whether that $4.99 item would even survive 10 washes. So that's a different factor. But it's like the rental thing. If you rent your clothes, you still have all the carbon emissions from shipping it back and forth. So carbon is everywhere in the way we do things. And until we electrify and move away from fossil fuels as the source of generating electricity, we're going to continue to pollute.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Mary. I'd like to, thank you for this, and it was very informative. Really enjoyed it. Couple of simple questions of things that you said tonight.
Mhm.
I think that, you talked about the website about Remark where we have the opportunity, because I think communicating,
Yep.
is the most important. And sharing our thoughts about the environment and all, and having a voice. So that website, is that just remark.com?
It's an app. So if you go to the App Store, and I think they have an app for both Android and iPhone, you'll need to download it. And when you download it, you register. I was amazed by this thing. I went to a poke place down the street from my house, and you would not think I could send an email through an app to a poke place, but they did, and they sent, and I got a response.
Wow.
Right. So, and they let you do that for all sorts of things, including brands. It's a great feedback mechanism to the degree where I'd love to, collaborate with a company and build that right into Earth911.
Oh, okay. All right. I wanted to ask you about, protecting ourselves from new clothing.
Mhm.
Many times I buy new clothing, I don't wash it, I wear it. People have commented, well, you should wash anything you buy new. Is that what you would recommend?
I think it's a good idea because you're gonna remove anything that is, and this is not a chemical statement, loose, right? So there's material on the material that will wash off, but there will also be chemicals in the material. And so as you use an item of particularly a plastic material, clothing made of plastic material, over the course of time, some of that will leach out onto your skin. So the wash is a good idea because you're going to get rid of your initial exposure to it, or at least reduce your initial exposure, but it doesn't eliminate the problem.
Right, and cold water.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you to repeat the 4 brands, service brands that you said are doing things the best.
I don't have it right in front of me. Patagonia is absolutely, I think, the world leader in doing things right in the clothing industry. Everlane, which is a sporting goods clothing company. Let me see if I can find that list here. I'm sorry, I should be able to remember these things, but I find that as the years pass, it's less doable. Patagonia, Everlane, and Reformation were the 3 that I pointed out as particularly ethical and sustainable production processes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
Very
you.
enjoyable.
Don't you think the education of our young people is a priority?
Yeah,
Hello?
I do. I stopped
Disappeared.
sharing.
Because it seems like I find the young people, you go to the mall and they have to have a certain brand, and it's very expensive. Especially those jeans that have more holes in it than it has material, but they have to, and they pay an exorbitant amount of money
Yeah.
for them. And I just want to say one other, I think that's where it should start, to help educate them, because people are sometimes set in modes, you can't change them. But I did notice that Land's End
Mhm.
had some recycle. I bought a dress. It's made with plastics and recycled polyester.
Mhm.
It's beautiful. It has vibrant colors. People have stopped me where I've gotten it. And they had jackets, but now they no longer do it. They offer none of the recycling.
Have you communicated to them that you miss it and that you would like to see them come back?
No, they limited the items. I think I got it, the dress on a real cheap because nobody was buying it. And I said, I'll try it. And it was never a mistake.
Yep.
I love it. I ran upstairs just to check all the parts of it. But it's recycled in China. They had all 2 or 3 labels that are all in Chinese, but still. But
You want to know the most effective way I've ever found to get the brand to think about this is to walk in and go, you used to have this, and I'll order it. Let me order it.
But
And then they think,
I don't know what they would. You set up how many things you have.
Yeah.
They won't do it anymore. They
Mhm.
stopped it. And then the other thing
I understand. My point is that even if they have stopped it, tell them that you would like to order it, because it's like literally waving money in the face of somebody, and they'll pay attention.
I might have been the only one who bought it. I don't know.
You might very well have been, but one person saying, I want this thing, is more powerful than 10 people not buying the bad option.
But I think the education of our young people,
Yes.
they're so involved. It's media, television sets, newspapers, magazines. You've got to buy Vera Wang wedding dresses, and
Yeah.
you'll be surprised how forceful these people have become.
Yes.
And their minds are set. You have to get that particular brand. And
One of my proudest moments recently was my daughter, who is getting married in June, got a used wedding dress,
yeah,
which makes a big difference.
I put mine out for reuse. Thank you. You're very
Thank you.
informative.
Hi, Mitch, I have a comment, and first of all, it was wonderful. I'm actually a sustainable fashion brand and style consultant, and I have
Send me an email. I'd love to talk to you.
absolutely. I have a podcast called Stylishly Sustainable, where I actually interview sustainable brands,
Mhm.
young brands,
Mhm.
to tell their stories. And I think because this is the way that you start knowing these brands have such beautiful stories to begin with, how they get started, why they get started, the products that they do. And a lot of people don't know about them, and I feel like when you hear that, there's your option, there's your option to, you didn't get that dress from Land's End, but then all of a sudden you hear a story of this other brand that has a beautiful dress, and you hear how they make it and everything that they do. And it's true, it is education, and it's not just an education of young people. I think it's an education of everyone, because Gen Z is very much involved in what is sustainable fashion.
And so not only in our communication as like journalists, right?
Mhm.
What Earth911 does, brands are going to start to recognize, and I do talk to about a lot about this, that telling that story, we really did make a change, and it was
That's right.
hard.
Mhm.
And that's the hardest thing for brands to do, is admit that they aren't perfect, right? Well, this is hard. Anybody who tells you that they know how we're going to become sustainable is lying.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. The one thing I tell people all the time is, what these brands are mostly sustainable. There are items that are not sustainable. And some of them are like, I'm so sorry, I'm trying. They do try because they're small enough to try. And no one is 100%. If someone tells you they're 100%, they're lying to you, because there is something there, whether it's a part that they're using it, or the way they ship it, or there's
Yeah.
something, but they're trying. And that is. a
And we have
big
to,
part of it.
have to encourage that, so I'll use-
Absolutely.
There's a product that we reviewed on Earth911, Jiminy's dog treats. They're
Mm,
made with cricket protein.
Mm.
They use 99.9% less water. The land needed to grow the protein is 99.9% less than farming.
Mhm.
It's brilliant. It is the most sustainable product I've ever seen. It ships in a plastic bag.
There are a lot of
Right.
interesting
That's right.
questions in the chat. Could you get to those?
I just was, in
Fine.
fact, so and
We
there are a
also-
lot of them here.
We have a
Go ahead.
hand raised also over there, I believe.
Okay.
Hi,
Oh, hey,
yes,
hey.
hi.
Did you hear me?
My name, yes, Fikayomi. I currently live in the UK and I'm Nigerian. I recently finished my MBA at Alliance Manchester Business School. And while I was, doing my MBA there, many people just used to ask me about my outfits. I used to wear lots of African prints, and I'd always just done fashion as a hobby. And sometime in 2021, I decided to make it a brand. So I've got a brand now, and I'm very slow fashion oriented. So for me, it's like the African fashion scene is really booming. I think the market size is like $35 billion. So it's really booming. So I imagine that, the impact on fast fashion is huge as well, right? So it's like, I'm struggling to find how I can make a change. I mostly use cotton for so there's this fabric we use called Ankara. It's like batik wax.
Yep.
So it's like you talked about linen. So now it's like, do I use linen? And I'm also like telling people, I also do alteration services. I've got a sewing machine, so I do alteration services for people. I'm asking people to donate whenever I have like pop-up events. I ask people to donate. But it's like, what do you know about the impact of fast fashion or African fashion on fast fashion generally? And
I wish I knew more. I really wish. You're asking a great question, and this is emblematic of the kind of global rise in consumption that I was talking about earlier. I mean, it is so many more people are living better, and thank God, but we're living a very wasteful life, and so making more deliberate choices. So your focus on slow fashion and durability is absolutely the right one. There are. And since you all are in the New York area, Fordham University has a sustainable fashion program that is doing a lot of interesting stuff, and they host events. You may want to go check them out. Frank Zambrelli is the guy who runs the program. So if you look up Frank Zambrelli and Fordham University, you might find some links to events that they're hosting.
Oh, is that in the US?
Yes.
Okay, I live in the UK, but maybe
Oh,
there
okay, I'm sorry. I didn't catch that. I thought you said you grew up in the UK.
it's past 1 a.m. here.
So this is the audience is generally in New York, as I understand it. But these
Okay.
might be virtual events. So if you look up Frank Zambrelli and Fordham University, check out and see whether they have events about sustainable fashion that you can attend remotely.
Okay, thank you.
The question I have not been watching chat, but I'm going to go back through it now. So I'm going to start from the bottom, and I apologize to anybody I don't get to. So this is a question from Lynn. Why are all these toxic products even allowed? This is a health and safety concern. Are there any efforts being made to limit their use? No. Here's why. And I don't want to get into the politics of this too much, but you might remember we were a heavily regulated economy about 50 years ago, and everybody in the world trusted our products. We might want to consider that as having been a good investment. But the other thing that has happened is the pace of invention has accelerated so much that there is no way to review the materials that are being introduced in the market. There are literally 13,000 new types of chemical invented every year. How can you track all that and all their long-term health effects? It's just, we don't have a system in place to control this. So unfortunately, there really isn't that much effort in the regulatory realm, but there are consumer movements that you can join. And you can look at organizations like Greenpeace and I'm going to mangle names, so I won't go any further on that. But I mean, you can find organizations that are looking to create more accountability. And that's why it's a good idea to look for those various certifications we were talking about as well. Moving on up here. We just talked about African fashion. Thank you for that question. Let's see. I don't know what the Lupus Foundation does with their donated clothing. It's a great question. I would encourage you to ask. And if you get an answer, please send me the answer because I would like to know. Let's see. This is a comment from Rajneet. Some people would understand the impacts on environment, but not many and all. Has government tried to take any action or made any plans to restrict the amount of waste coming from every single home or industry? No, they aren't restricting the amount of waste, but they do raise the cost of waste. And that is something you're going to see more often, particularly in this highly inflationary environment. The other thing that's going to happen where states are taking real action is in an area called extended producer responsibility. And New York is debating this right now. 4 states have put these laws in place that require the companies that make the material to pay for collecting and processing the recycling of the material. And they're requiring that they do that. What happens when these laws pass is they set up something called a producer responsibility organization, which is a quasi-public entity that is funded by the companies that, in this case, want to sell plastic in the state. Colorado, for instance, just passed this law. That producer responsibility organization is required to be funded by the manufacturers based on a percentage of the revenue that they earn in the state. So you're going to start to see not limiting the amount of waste, but better investments in recycling. I was saying there's actually reason to be hopeful here, that are going to improve the ability to recycle. But, and here's the thing, and I have to think about this every day because we get hundreds of questions from people about how to recycle. And I answer a lot of them. The problem with recycling is that it is hard, it's complicated. The rules vary from literally zip code to zip code. I can go down the road 2 miles, and at my house, I have to take the bottle cap off for the bottle to be accepted by the recycling program. 2 miles down the road, they have to leave the cap on. That's confusing. And so if I sit down and talk with my friend from 2 miles down the road at the Starbucks up the street, and I say, you know, you should keep the bottle cap on, he goes, no, you should take the bottle cap off. We actually are both right, but we're only right in our local context. So the investments that we're going to make need to not just create capacity, but need to have programs that make it attractive to recycle. Deposit laws have been proven to raise recycling and recovery rates, as well as the quality of the material recovered dramatically by 20 and 30% when they're put in place. Europe has deposit laws everywhere, and the recycling rates there are 3 and 4 times what ours are. So I think that's where you're going to see government taking action, is to create incentives. And my belief is that in the long run, just like going to the store and buying all this stuff is a great service experience, or at least is in the best cases, recycling is going to become like that too, that it's going to be kind of like a concierge service that you'll get from the brand or from the community through the financing of the brand to say, we want this stuff back, we're going to make it easy. So any more questions? I'm looking through this. I think I've covered most of them. Please go ahead, Ann. You are on mute.
Okay, all right, sometimes things just get so worn out. I can't give it to a thrift store. And now I'm learning, all right, what do I do with it? I thought of bundling this stuff in a bag and asking the thrift store if they sell this stuff to rag buyers, but I'm hearing from you, this probably is not the best thing. It gets sold to some country that puts it in landfill.
A lot of it, yeah. So you remember we were talking about making things last longer. I have the same problem, right? My jeans look like the kids pay for, but I don't want them to look that way. So I think, I got to get rid of these things. Just extending the life, even in your own home, make it into a rag, wash the windows with it, give it 5, 10, 15 more uses as a rag before you do throw it away. That's a step. It isn't a perfect step, but it is in the right direction. And then the other thing, and everybody, please take note of this. Go to a city council or a solid waste management committee meeting in your city and take the stuff you want to recycle and show it to them. You can be really dramatic and dump it out, but that might be kind of rude. But take it and say, look, we should be able to take care of this. We're this great community. Why are we letting this stuff end up in the landfill? City council people, waste management people will respond because you are their constituents. It's not like Congress where we're 3,000 miles away and they come visit us every once in a while. They live in our community and they want to be good stewards of everything that we do together. So show them what you want to recycle and tell them that you'll take the effort. It may take a while, and it may take getting 50 of your friends to write letters or come with you and show their material too. But let's make it plain for our representatives what we want them to do. And generally, they'll take that leadership from the people. Let's see, I think another one question here. How can we convince customers with a low income that they're buying clothes from clothing stores such as Primark that they need to make a shift to sustainable clothing? I think this is like the question we were talking about, the poverty-stricken person who takes the job because it's their only option. We should be thinking about the education of our youth so that they are well informed about that decision. The state of the public schools in this country right now troubles me deeply because I don't think we spend any time on teaching people the empathy for one another and for the environment that would be required for you to go, I could buy this clothing at a cheap store and all the pollution that comes with it, but I decided not to. That's a value-based decision that has to be built on information. And you can't just say it's bad. Don't do that to somebody who has a low income because they want to feel good with some new clothing. But if you can encourage them to feel good with clothing that lasts, that they can talk about the care they take of it, the way that, and I always feel so old when I say these things, the way our grandparents did. My grandmother mended all the clothing she owned. I don't remember. I mean, buying clothing for her was like a once every year thing. And she wasn't impoverished. She just took care of stuff. That's the kind of ethos that we need to engender in the schools, not just the bad elements of what's wrong with the environment because of all of us bad people, but here's how we can make a better impact ourselves. The positive story is the key to changing society. And I think that's it. We're very close to the end. Are there any other questions from the remaining folks?
Oh, and again.
Yeah.
And again, I just got an idea. I hope I have the nerve to
Go for
to
it.
the library and suggest instead of, in addition to a knitting hour, a mending hour.
Lovely
People
idea. Lovely.
bring- So I'm going to do this.
And there are reuse and repair locations popping up, not just for clothing, but electronics and other things too. Look for, there's organizations, maker organizations that are popping up everywhere, and they often fund, repair facilities for computers or phones. And there's certainly an analogy there to getting people together to curate mending stuff, patches, everything. And let's just start to get the community to do these things again. Well, hey, thank you, everybody. It really has been a pleasure to talk with all of you, and I appreciate the questions. They are great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank everybody for joining us. And we're going to be following Earth 911. Thank you so
Thank you.
much. It's great.
You all have a wonderful green evening.
You too. Thank you. Thank you.
You
care.
too. You
Bye-bye.
too.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.